When Sid and Marty Krofft started making Saturday morning television shows up until the late 60s, from about 1960 to about 1969, Saturday morning television was dominated by cartoon shows. And cartoon shows were under a lot of attack in those days because a lot of the pressure groups thought the cartoon shows weren't good for little kids. They gave them the bad ideas, too many superheroes, that kind of thing. And what Sid and Marty Krofft did was they essentially, almost single-handedly, brought back the whole idea of the live show that had been popular in the 50s with Howdy Doody and people like that. But they did it in a much different fashion. They did it in a kind of a glitzy, Las Vegas, Hollywood, overblown style. And because they brought those big production values to Saturday morning television, production values which are often less expensive than they seem to be, but they were very colorful. They pretty much blew out a lot of the cartoon competition because the kids were now seeing live people acting and comporting themselves in the manner in which a cartoon character did. I compare that to when Popeye was popular in cartoons and television in the 50s. And for a long time, Popeye ran everything in the local television markets. Then the Three Stooges movies were released. And Wacko, the Three Stooges are live-action cartoons. And I think the same thing happened again with Sid and Marty Krofft. They brought live-action cartoons spectacularly to Saturday morning TV. H.R. Pufnstuf was the first of the shows that did extremely well for the Kroffts, and of course it led to all their other shows. The Kroffts themselves say that their most successful property was Land of the Lost. But not necessarily the Land of the Lost that was on in the 70s. The one that really did well, surprisingly enough, was the remake in the 90s, which a lot of purists don't like because they did a lot of changes in the format. But in terms of making money at the time, it made a great deal of money. But in the long run, the more lasting shows were the H.R. Pufnstufs and the Bugaloos. There were a few shows along the way that didn't do as well as they want them to. The Lost Saucer, for example, Far Out Space Nuts. But essentially, I would say that Land of the Lost was probably, in the long run, their most successful show. And also was one of the few shows that actually broke the barrier down. Children and adults enjoy that equally. Whereas H.R. Pufnstuf, it wasn't as big an adult attraction as it was for kids. But Land of the Lost, because it had all those science fiction people, the Star Trek expatriates working for them, it broke down the barriers and really appealed to a much broader audience. Several Star Trek people did work for Land of the Lost. There's several very famous science fiction writers. David Gerrold, who wrote The Trouble with Tribbles, was the Land of the Lost story editor for the first year. D.C. Fontana wrote scripts. Other famous science fiction names like Ben Bova, Theodore Sturgeon, Larry Niven. It was the first two seasons. The third season kind of became a little more like Lost in Space, but the first two seasons was trying to find that happy medium. They were, David Gerrold, in fact, says, I don't believe that television is geared towards a 12-year-old mind, so I'm not going to write for the 12-year-old mind. 12-year-olds liked the show, but that didn't mean that the people older than 12 didn't. H.R. Pufnstuf was Sid and Marty Krofft's idea, but the writing was essentially in the hands of two very talented situation comedy veterans. Lenny Weinrib, who was also a comedian. You may remember in the Dick Van Dyke Show, he's the hypnotist. No, actually, he was the practical joker that told him to scream like a chicken in that one episode. And Lenny Weinrib's partner, Paul Harrison. Lenny Weinrib also did the voice of H.R. Pufnstuf. Now, Weinrib and Harrison wrote for a lot of sitcoms, including All in the Family. And I think they pretty much set the tone. They knew how to do comedy structure. They knew how to build in characters and have them in a cohesive plot. Later on, they would have writers like John Fenton Murray in later shows who did a lot of McHale's Navies. But they were essentially veteran, seasoned sitcom people. They knew how to write a little bit down to kids, but not so far down that it became puerile. So essentially, I would say, while the creation of H.R. Pufnstuf was wholly Sid and Marty Krofft's, the comedy tone of the show, the kind of partly smart aleck type of thing, the TV showbiz savvy kind of thing that you would see occasionally in the episodes, was the product of Weinrib and Harrison. A very talented team. The popular lasting appeal of Pufnstuf is partly due to the nostalgia, partly due to the baby boomers, but on the other hand, whenever they rerun this program on a cable service, it's the kids that watch it. Kids, as jaded as they may be by video games and by the superhero action stars, kids of a certain age and just a little older kind of like to see colorful, dancing, happy characters, anthropomorphic characters. That's the longevity of Sesame Street there too. They like to see these positive characters. They like to see characters having fun on television, and they kind of transfer the fun to the audience. Also, it's kind of exotic. You're not in real life going to meet anybody like H.R. Pufnstuf. You'll generally meet somebody like one of the kids in the more educational programs, but it's the exotic appeal. Gee, I'd like to know those people. It was like when we were growing up. When I was growing up, I'd watch Disneyland, and I would accept Mickey and Donald and these characters as living, breathing entities, even though I knew they weren't really. And I said, wouldn't it be wonderful if Donald would come to my house, or if Mickey would come to my house, or Ludwig von Drake? And I think kids still get that feeling. No matter how much other kinds of entertainment is out there, they still like to fantasize a little bit about that. And I think Pufnstuf brings it, and I think also because Pufnstuf is fun. It's buoyant, it's ebullient. There's nothing negative about it, really. Even the villains are kind of fun in their own way. There's nothing dark about the show. It's a lot of fun, and kids like to have fun. There's not a lot of fun going around in the world. And I think that the more they get, the better they like it. The great Sid and Marty Krofft versus McDonald's debacle began in the late 60s when McDonald's approached Sid and Marty Krofft, Representative McDonald, saying, we'd like to start a new kind of colorful ad campaign using the sort of characters that you've created for your television programs and your other projects. So Sid and Marty Krofft came up with a bunch of ideas about different characters and colorful lands and how they could have talking hamburgers and talking French fries and things like that. And on the verge of the deal being solidified, the deal being finalized, papers had been signed, and production was going to begin. Then McDonald said, "No, we're going to change. We're going to go into a different direction." So the Kroffts chalked it down. They said, "Well, we did a lot of work. We'll just have to cut our losses and move on to something else." Well, around 1970, 1971, they started noticing the McDonald's ads had this McDonald Land motif with Mayor McCheese and Grimace and the Hamburglar. And they also began to notice that the McDonald Land, the topography and the colors very closely resembled the land that was on H.R. Pufnstuf. And they also noticed that Mayor McCheese bore a startling resemblance to H.R. Pufnstuf. And they started noticing that some of the other subliminal characters also had that very close resemblance. And it began to dawn on them. They wanted the benefit of our expertise. McDonald's wanted the benefit of the Kroffts' expertise. They wanted the benefit of the Kroffts showing how to make puppet characters work, how to design costumes. But in the long run, that's really all they wanted. They wanted to go off in their own direction. And, well, that was, in no uncertain terms, plagiarism. As like Red Skelton once said, imitation is not the sincerest form of flattery, it's plagiarism. The Kroffts were unhappy, they complained to McDonald's, McDonald's blew them off. The Kroffts took the McDonald's to court and gave point-by-point explanations, point-by-point demonstrations of how McDonald's had essentially, to use vernacular, ripped off the idea of H.R. Pufnstuf for their Mayor McCheese characters. McDonald's would counter by saying, well, Mayor McCheese wears a sash and H.R. Pufnstuf doesn't wear a sash and that kind of stuff. But the judge didn't buy it. And so, believe it or not, in a very interesting decision, David won over Goliath. The Kroffts won against McDonald's. So thereafter, when there were the McDonald Land characters, the Kroffts got a pretty tidy sum. The McDonald's people aren't going to tell you how much that sum was, but they are getting. They did get compensation for that. And what amazed the Kroffts and amazes them to this day was that that the McDonald's people apparently actually thought the Kroffts wouldn't catch on, that they wouldn't see the resemblance. They said, it's as plain as the nose in your face. How could you not miss this? You can give us all the legalese in the world, but that's what you're doing to us. But what really hurt the Kroffts at the time was, not only did the McDonald Land thing rip off their ideas, but people in the industry who saw these McDonald's commercials assumed that the Kroffts were doing the McDonald's commercials, and then they lost a lot of possible sponsorship deals. But the crushing blow came when there was a national ice show that had used the Pufnstuf characters, dropped the Pufnstuf characters in favor of the McDonald Land characters. So you see, it wasn't just a matter of money. The money wasn't the big deal. In fact, they didn't ask for a lot of money. It was essentially the principle of the thing. You're taking our livelihood away by doing this. And that's what stuck in their craw. McDonald's, I guess, assumed we're too big to be bothered. We're too important. But the Krofft said, no, you're not that important that you can't be called to account for something you did that we don't like. And they won.